Just past midnight on the night of the 6th into the 7th of July 2026, Russian radar operators along the Sea of Azov picked up something they'd been dreading for months. Not one or two stray drones probing the coastline, but a coordinated multi-night operation that would, by the time it was finished, leave 13 vessels of Russia's so-called shadow fleet burning, disabled, or dead in the water. Tankers, a cargo ship, even a ferry working the Kerch route, all hit in a rolling wave of strikes that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces carried out over roughly 48 hours. Just when it looked like Moscow had absorbed the blow and would quietly reroute its fuel convoys and move on, something else happened. Something that turned a bad week for the Kremlin into what may be remembered as the moment Russia's occupation of Crimea started running on borrowed time. To understand why this specific stretch of water became the epicenter of one of the most damaging naval logistics campaigns of the entire war, you have to understand what the Shadow Fleet actually is and why Russia can't simply do without it. When sanctions cut Moscow off from mainstream tanker operators, insurers, and shipping registries after the full-scale invasion, Russia didn't lose the ability to move oil. It built a workaround instead. Older tankers, bought secondhand, reflagged to obscure jurisdictions, insured through murky or self-insured arrangements, crewed in ways designed to make ownership deliberately hard to trace. That parallel fleet has grown to more than 1,500 vessels worldwide by some industry estimates, and it's the backbone of how Russia keeps exporting oil despite years of sanctions pressure. But a smaller, more specific slice of that fleet exists purely to keep occupied Crimea supplied, ferrying fuel across the Sea of Azov into the port city of Kerch, fuel that isn't destined for some overseas buyer, but for the tanks, generators, and aircraft of the garrison holding the peninsula. That distinction between Shadow Fleet as sanctions workaround and Shadow Fleet as active military supply line is exactly why Ukraine has treated this specific corridor differently from the rest of Russia's tanker network, and exactly why its drone forces commander described the operation bluntly as a shooting gallery. The first strikes came on the night of July 6th, when Ukrainian drones hit two tankers, the Kapitan Barman and Sanar 3, catching Russian defenses flat-footed in an area they had clearly not expected a raid of this scale. That alone would have been a notable night by the standards of most weeks in this war. It turned out to be the opening move. The following night, the 6th, rolling into the 7th, Ukraine's unmanned systems forces struck 8 more vessels in a single coordinated operation, all confirmed sanctioned tankers with a dead weight of around 7,000 tons each, roughly 140 meters long, most of them built sometime between 2006 and 2012, aging ships kept in service specifically because newer, more reputable operators want nothing to do with sanctioned Russian cargo. Ukraine's drone commander Robert Brovdy, known across the front by his call sign Magyar, posted the news the way he often does, blunt and almost gleeful, saying the Shadow Fleet was leaving the area, and that the battle for fuel supplies to Crimea in the Sea of Azov would continue. Later that same day, 2 more tankers were hit, bringing the 2-day total to 12. A ferry and a cargo ship working the same corridor were also struck in the surrounding operation, and once every vessel from that stretch of nights was tallied, Ukrainian officials put the number at 13 ships from the Shadow Fleet specifically, alongside the additional cargo and ferry traffic caught in the same sweep. What makes this campaign different from a single dramatic raid is the way it was clearly built, layer by layer, to overwhelm Russia's defenses through repetition rather than through any single overwhelming strike. Russia has spent years building exactly the kind of layered defense meant to make the Kerch approach survivable. Electronic warfare systems along the coast, designed to jam drone control links and spoof satellite navigation, long-range S-400 batteries positioned to intercept anything that slips past the jamming, shorter-range Panzer systems to catch stragglers, and naval escorts riding alongside the convoys themselves with close-in weapons for anything that gets within visual range. On paper, that's a formidable gauntlet, and it's worth being honest that Russia's own defense ministry has claimed real success against these waves, stating publicly that dozens of drones were suppressed by electronic warfare and crashed before ever reaching their targets. That claim is plausible and consistent with how this kind of raid typically goes. Layered defenses do shoot down a meaningful share of any attacking formation, and Ukraine almost certainly loses drones on every single one of these missions. The problem for Russia is that layered defense built around a single choke point has a mathematical weakness baked into it from the start. Every drone that gets through doesn't need to defeat the whole system. It only needs to find the one gap where jamming coverage is thinnest, where 2 radar pictures overlap and create confusion instead of clarity, where a decoy pulls a Panzer crew's attention in the wrong direction for the 10 or 15 seconds it takes a second wave to slip past at wave-top height. And because Ukraine is running these raids not as isolated events, but as a rolling, near-nightly campaign, Russian defenders don't get to reset and recalibrate after each engagement. They're defending the same stretch of water against the same evolving tactics night after night, while Ukraine studies what worked, what didn't, and adjusts accordingly for the next wave. That asymmetry, one side iterating faster than the other can adapt, is really the engine driving this entire operation. It's also worth being honest about what parts of this story are solidly confirmed and what parts remain harder to verify independently. Multiple outlets, Reuters among them, along with the Kyiv Independent, Ukrainska Pravda, and the Moscow Times, all reported the core numbers consistently. 8 tankers struck on the night of the 6th into the 7th, 2 more hit later that day, and 2 additional vessels the night before, bringing the running total across those days to a dozen sanctioned tankers, plus the cargo ship and ferry that rounded the broader tally out to 13 or more, depending on how you count vessel types. Reuters also noted something worth flagging honestly rather than glossing over, that of the vessels initially identified by Ukraine as struck in one particular wave, only 2 were confirmed under international sanctions at the time of reporting. A reminder that Ukraine's own battlefield claims, however largely consistent with independent confirmation, aren't always perfectly precise in real time, and that outside journalists have repeatedly noted they could not independently verify every frame of drone footage or every ship identification Kyiv released. The broad shape of the campaign, though, is not in dispute. Russian regional officials themselves confirmed tanker damage in the Taganrog Bay during this same window, with the governor of Rostov region describing UAVs attacking 2 tankers, fires breaking out on both, and crews being evacuated, which lends real outside credibility to Ukraine's account, even where individual details can't be checked line by line. So the raw military picture is clear enough. Ukraine ran a sustained multi-night drone campaign against Russia's Crimea-bound Shadow Fleet, hit somewhere in the range of 12 to 13 tankers directly along with additional cargo and ferry traffic, and did it despite facing a defensive network built specifically to prevent exactly this kind of operation. That alone would be a significant story. But it's the part that came after, the part hinted at in every version of this headline, that turned a rough week for Russian logistics into something that started reshaping the strategic picture around Crimea entirely. What happened next was that Russia, faced with a fuel supply route that had just proven far less safe than its planners assumed, didn't simply absorb the damage and keep running convoys on the same schedule. It reacted, publicly and in ways that signaled real strain rather than routine defensive posturing. Within days, Russia's government announced a ban on diesel exports, extending at least through the end of the month, explicitly framed as part of a package of measures meant to support the domestic fuel market after systematic Ukrainian strikes, both on refineries deep inside Russian territory and now on the tanker route into Crimea, had triggered gasoline shortages and price spikes serious enough to require a national policy response. That's not the kind of move a government makes over a single bad night. That's the kind of move a government makes when the cumulative pressure across weeks and months of strikes has started genuinely threatening domestic fuel security, not just military logistics in one theater. On the peninsula itself, the effects were even more direct. Crimea's authorities moved to declare a state of emergency tied specifically to the fuel and logistics disruption, an extraordinary admission for a Russian-occupied territory that Moscow has spent years insisting was fully secure, fully integrated, and firmly under control. Civilian fuel sales on the peninsula were suspended or severely rationed in the aftermath of these strikes, with even senior Russian officials publicly discussing subsidies to manage the shortage, a level of visible strain that stands in sharp contrast to years of Kremlin messaging about Crimea's stability under Russian rule. Ukraine, for its part, didn't let the moment pass quietly. It escalated the diplomatic argument alongside the military one, with Kyiv's deputy prime minister formally writing to the International Maritime Organization to make the case that vessels transporting fuel and oil that directly finance and supply Moscow's war effort have effectively forfeited any claim to being treated as ordinary civilian commercial shipping. That's a serious, deliberate escalation of the legal and diplomatic framing around this entire campaign, an attempt to get international bodies to formally recognize what Ukraine has been arguing in practice for months. That a tanker moving fuel to an occupying military garrison isn't a neutral merchant ship no matter what flag it happens to be flying. Russia, predictably, pushed back hard, accusing Ukraine of committing acts of terrorism against commercial shipping and maritime piracy, a framing Moscow has used repeatedly across this entire campaign of strikes on Shadow Fleet vessels, going back through incidents in the Mediterranean, off the coast of Turkey, and now in the Sea of Azov itself. And this is where the story stopped being just about one bad week for a handful of tankers and started looking like the leading edge of something much larger. In the days immediately following this strike wave, Ukraine didn't pause to let Russia recover. Instead, the tempo accelerated. Within another 48 hours, Ukraine's drone forces commander announced yet another wave. 9 more Shadow Fleet tankers hit overnight, pushing the running total for the broader operation past 20 vessels in just 72 hours. By the time independent trackers and multiple outlets tallied the full scope of what became known as the Sea of Azov campaign, the count for the period from the 6th through the 9th of July had climbed to 35 separate ships struck, according to Ukraine's own figures, an operation Kyiv described as its largest strike campaign against the Shadow Fleet since the start of the full-scale invasion. For comparison, the Ukrainian Navy's previous major push against Russian tankers off Turkey's northern coast and in the Mediterranean, spread out over 3 full weeks in late 2025, had damaged 6 vessels total. What happened in the Sea of Azov over a handful of nights in July 2026 dwarfed that entire prior campaign in both scale and speed. Alongside the naval strikes, Ukraine kept up parallel pressure on Crimea's infrastructure more broadly, hitting electrical substations, fuel depots, radar systems, and missile installations across the peninsula in the same window, with tallies running into dozens of energy facilities targeted over the following days. It's worth being clear about why that matters beyond simply adding to a body count of targets destroyed. A tanker that survives the run into Kerch still has to unload into a storage and distribution network that's simultaneously being hit from the air, night after night. Fuel that does arrive has to be rationed, prioritized, and moved under steadily worsening conditions, with less redundancy in the system every time a depot or substation goes offline. None of these individual strikes, taken alone, would be decisive. Together, sustained over weeks, rather than a single dramatic night, they start to look like a deliberate, coordinated effort to strangle the logistics network keeping the occupation functional, one convoy and one substation at a time. There's a broader strategic lesson buried in all of this that goes well beyond the specific numbers from any single week, and it's worth spelling out plainly because it says something about where this kind of warfare is heading more generally. For decades, protecting a strategic waterway or a high-value logistics route meant investing in a small number of extremely capable, extremely expensive platforms, and betting that sophistication would reliably beat sheer numbers. What's played out in the Sea of Azov suggests that bet is getting much harder to make with confidence. A country without a traditional blue water navy has managed to impose real, sustained, quantifiable costs on a far larger conventional military power, not by matching it system for system, but by accepting attrition on cheap, increasingly autonomous drones produced and lost in numbers that would be unthinkable for crewed ships or manned aircraft, and by simply running that attrition campaign faster and more relentlessly than the other side can adapt to it. It's also important not to overstate where this leaves things, because it would be a mistake to treat this as some kind of final, decisive turning point in the war. Russia's logistics network, even under this kind of sustained pressure, has repeatedly shown real resilience, an ability to reroute, ration, subsidize, and adapt rather than simply collapse. Crimea has weathered fuel shortages and infrastructure strikes for well over a year without the occupation there ending or the garrison withdrawing. Diesel export bans and emergency declarations are serious signals of strain, not indicators of imminent surrender. What campaigns like this one tend to do, when they work, is grind down efficiency and raise the cost of occupation steadily over time, rather than deliver a single knockout blow. And that's a less dramatic story than any single night's headline count of ships destroyed. But it's probably the more accurate way to understand why Ukraine keeps running this operation night after night instead of treating any one raid as the decisive one. There's also a quieter, less visible kind of pressure building underneath all of this that's easy to miss if you only follow the headline numbers. Every tanker that burns in the Sea of Azov is also a data point for the insurers and shipping brokers who make the Shadow Fleet possible in the first place. Those vessels only function as a sanctions workaround because someone is willing to insure them, crew them, and broker their cargo, usually at a premium that reflects the risk involved. That risk premium has been climbing for a while as this campaign has intensified, and a sustained run of tankers being set ablaze in a specific, well-defined corridor is exactly the kind of pattern that pushes it higher still. At some point, the economics for a ship owner or broker simply stop working, not because of any single strike, but because the cumulative pattern makes running this particular route too costly relative to what can be earned moving fuel elsewhere. That's a slower, less visible kind of pressure than a burning tanker on camera, but it may end up mattering just as much because it targets the financial incentive structure that keeps the Shadow Fleet operating at all. It's worth walking through, in a bit more detail, how a raid like this actually unfolds against the kind of defense Russia has built around the Kerch approach, because that's really where the drama of these headlines comes from. Russian electronic warfare units stationed along the coast, systems built to jam drone control links and spoof GPS and GLONASS navigation, are designed around a very reasonable assumption that if you sever the connection between a drone and its operator, the drone stops being a threat. For years, that assumption held up well against shorter-range tactical drones along the front. It holds up much less reliably against the longer-range strike drones Ukraine has increasingly built around inertial navigation, backed by onboard cameras and simple computer vision that can recognize a coastline or horizon line well enough to correct course without any outside signal at all. So when the jamming curtain goes up over the Sea of Azov, Some drones in any given formation almost certainly do drift, fail, or get shot down as a direct result. That kind of attrition happens on every one of these missions. But the formation as a whole doesn't need every drone to survive the jamming. It only needs enough of them to keep flying toward the target using onboard navigation alone. And that's precisely the capability Ukraine has spent the last 2 years building into its long-range strike drone program, specifically to defeat this kind of countermeasure. Once past the electronic warfare screen, any surviving drones run into Russia's harder defenses, the S-400 batteries positioned specifically to protect the Kerch crossing, backed by shorter-range Panzer systems meant to catch anything that slips through the outer layer, and naval escorts riding alongside the convoys with their own close-in weapons for anything that gets within visual range. This is a serious, professionally designed defense in depth, and Russia's own defense ministry has publicly claimed real success against these waves, describing dozens of drones suppressed by electronic warfare before ever reaching a target. That claim is entirely plausible. Layered air defense does shoot down a meaningful share of any attacking formation, and it would be dishonest to pretend Ukraine runs these missions without real losses. What seems to make the difference, based on the pattern across raid after raid in this campaign, isn't some single miracle technology, but a fairly simple and very old idea applied at scale with cheap, expendable platforms. When two radar systems cover the same stretch of open water from different angles, especially at night with heavy wave clutter, already making small, low-flying targets hard to distinguish from ordinary sea reflections, there's an overlap zone where each system's picture can interfere with the others rather than reinforcing it. A drone skimming just above the wave tops in that overlap can look almost identical to a strange radar return off the water itself. And two independent crews trying to sort real targets from clutter in the same patch of sky can end up hesitating at exactly the moment that hesitation matters most. Ukrainian operators appear to have leaned into exactly this seam repeatedly and paired it with basic decoy tactics. Some drones climbing and brightening their radar signature to draw fire and attention, while others hug the water and use the resulting distraction to close the last few miles from an angle the defenders weren't watching as closely. None of this is exotic. Drawing fire with a decoy while the real strike comes from another direction is one of the oldest tricks in warfare. What's different here is that Ukraine can afford to run this play over and over, losing decoy drones that cost a small fraction of what Russia spends shooting them down in a way that simply isn't sustainable for the defender over months of repeated raids. The reason this matters beyond the tactical detail is that it explains why Russia's defensive posture, however professionally built, keeps producing the same result night after night. Adding a second S-400 battery to cover more sky doesn't just add more missiles, it adds another radar picture that has to be reconciled with the first one in real time, under pressure, at night, over open water, full of clutter. Sometimes more defense creates more certainty. Sometimes it just creates more confusion for the humans trying to make split-second decisions about what's real. The pattern across this entire Sea of Azov campaign suggests Russia has been running into the second problem far more often than its planners would like. The international reaction to this whole episode is worth walking through carefully too, because it shows how far this fight has spread beyond the water itself. Russia's response wasn't limited to the diesel export ban and the emergency declaration in Crimea, though those alone were striking admissions of strain. Russian officials also leaned harder into the terrorism and piracy framing they've used throughout this broader campaign against the Shadow Fleet, arguing that strikes on commercial tankers, whatever cargo they're carrying or whoever their ultimate customer is, cross a line into attacking civilian shipping that international law is supposed to protect. That argument isn't pure propaganda to be waved away. It reflects a genuine, unsettled question in maritime law about where commercial shipping ends and military logistics begins when a single vessel serves both functions depending on the day. Ukraine's counter-argument, formalized in that letter to the International Maritime Organization, is that a ship knowingly moving sanctioned fuel to resupply an occupying military force has functionally opted out of civilian protections the moment it accepts that cargo, regardless of what flag is painted on its hull or what paperwork claims otherwise. Neither side's legal position has been definitively settled by any international body, and it's likely to keep being argued out in exactly these kinds of forms long after this particular week of strikes has faded from the headlines. Western governments, for their part, largely stayed on the sidelines of the legal argument while continuing to tighten sanctions enforcement around Shadow Fleet operators more broadly, part of a slower, ongoing effort that predates this specific operation by years. NATO allies, meeting around the same period, were focused on broader questions of continued military and financial support for Ukraine, including fresh aid pledges running into the tens of billions of euros, a reminder that this naval campaign, however dramatic on its own terms, is one front in a much larger, multi-year war effort that touches everything from air defense funding to long-range strike capability to sanctions policy simultaneously. The fact that a story about burning tankers in the Sea of Azov was competing for attention that same week with headlines about Iran, about NATO summits, about entirely unrelated global news is itself a small reminder of how this war, now well into its 5th year, has to fight for public attention even as its individual chapters keep escalating in scale and consequence. It's also worth placing this specific operation inside the longer arc of Ukraine's campaign against the Shadow Fleet as a whole, because the Sea of Azov strikes didn't come out of nowhere. Ukraine has been chipping away at Russia's sanctioned tanker network for well over a year, using naval drones to hit vessels off the coast of Turkey in the Mediterranean, and even, in one widely reported case, off the coast of Libya, using a drone launched from Misrata to strike a tanker thousands of miles from Ukrainian shores. Ships like the Kairos and the Viret were hit with naval drones off Turkey's northern coast in late 2025. The tanker Elbis was struck near Turkey in January 2026. The Arctic Metagas, a liquefied natural gas carrier under sanctions, caught fire in the Mediterranean in March 2026, carrying tens of thousands of tons of cargo, eventually left adrift with a severe list and extensive hull damage. Each of these strikes on its own might read as an isolated incident. Taken together, they form a clear pattern of a deliberate, sustained campaign that escalated steadily in scale and boldness before culminating in the concentrated, multi-night operation against the Kerch-bound convoys in July 2026 that this story centers on. The Sea of Azov campaign wasn't a sudden escalation out of nowhere. It was the natural next step in a strategy Ukraine had already been running, patiently and repeatedly for well over a year. That longer view also helps explain why Russia's response this time went further than in previous incidents. Individual tanker strikes off Turkey or in the Mediterranean, however damaging to specific vessels or operators, didn't threaten the core fuel supply into Crimea itself in the same direct way. This operation did, hitting the specific narrow corridor that Crimea depends on most directly, at a moment when refinery strikes deep inside Russia were already straining domestic fuel supplies elsewhere. The timing compounded the pressure. A diesel export ban makes a very different kind of statement when it follows weeks of refinery strikes, and then, within days, a campaign that burns more than a dozen tankers on the one route feeding fuel directly to an occupied peninsula. It's the combination, refineries hit at home, tankers burning at sea, depots and substations hit on the peninsula itself, all landing in the same compressed window, that seems to have pushed the response from routine damage control into visible, public emergency measures. None of this means the campaign is guaranteed to keep escalating at the same pace indefinitely, and it would be a mistake to assume Russia has no further answers. Electronic warfare, radar filtering, and naval escort doctrine all continue to evolve in response to exactly this kind of pressure, and the specific tactical seams Ukrainian operators exploited on this particular set of raids are exactly the kind of thing that stops working once the other side has studied the pattern closely enough to close the gap. Russia has already shown, over the broader course of this war, that it can adapt by relocating vulnerable naval assets, adjusting patrol routes, and refining its jamming techniques in response to lessons learned from earlier losses. This remains very much an ongoing, evolving contest rather than a settled one, and the next chapter of this campaign is likely to look at least somewhat different from this one, simply because both sides are constantly studying what just happened and adjusting for what comes next. What does seem durable, based on the pattern across this entire stretch of the war, is the underlying strategic logic rather than any single tactic. As long as Ukraine keeps treating Crimea's fuel supply as a priority target, and as long as that fuel has to pass through a narrow, defensible, but ultimately porous corridor like the Kerch approach, this kind of exchange is likely to keep recurring in some form, even as the specific technical details on both sides keep shifting under pressure from each other. The real story of a week like this one isn't really about the exact number, whether it's 10 ships or 13 or 35, once every follow-up strike gets tallied. It's about a slow, grinding contest over who can adapt faster, fought out largely below the level of major headlines, one convoy, one jamming system, one diplomatic letter to an international body at a time, with each side testing how much pressure the other can absorb before something has to give, whether it's the 13 ships hit in that opening wave, or the diesel export ban that followed, or the state of emergency declared on the peninsula, or the diplomatic escalation at the International Maritime Organization, or the fact that the campaign kept accelerating rather than slowing down in the days afterward. The honest answer is that no single piece of it tells the whole story on its own. The strikes themselves demonstrated that Russia's layered defense around Kerch has real exploitable gaps. The economic and administrative response, the export ban, the emergency declaration, the fuel rationing, demonstrated that those gaps translate into genuine strategic pain rather than just a bad news cycle. And the diplomatic escalation demonstrated that Ukraine is now fighting this battle on two fronts simultaneously, in the air over the Sea of Azov and in the language of international maritime law, trying to permanently redefine what counts as a legitimate target in this war. Put all three of those pieces together and you get something considerably bigger than a single dramatic night of burning tankers. You get a campaign that's forcing Russia to spend more, defend more, ration more, and argue its case more urgently on the world stage, week after week, with no clear sign yet of where the ceiling on that pressure actually sits. What do you think mattered most here? The drones getting through Russia's defenses, the diesel ban, an emergency declaration that followed, or Ukraine's push to redefine these ships as legitimate military targets under international law? There's one final thread worth pulling on before we get to that question, because it's the part of this story that rarely makes the headline but probably matters most for how this campaign ends, if it ever fully does. Every one of these strikes, whatever else it accomplishes militarily, also lands as a message aimed at a much smaller, much quieter audience: the insurers, brokers, and ship management companies who make the entire Shadow fleet possible in the first place. A tanker only runs this specific route because someone somewhere is willing to underwrite the risk, and that willingness isn't infinite. It's priced, adjusted, and reconsidered every time a new incident makes the news, and a sustained run of vessels burning in one narrow, well-documented corridor is exactly the kind of pattern that eventually makes the insurance math stop working for a ship owner, regardless of how much Moscow is willing to subsidize the operation on the government side. That's a slower, less cinematic kind of pressure than a tanker exploding on camera, but over the length of a war now well into its fifth year, it may end up being the pressure that actually forces a permanent change in how fuel reaches Crimea long after any single night's headline count has been forgotten. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you want to keep following how this campaign develops, make sure you're subscribed, because by every indication, this is far from the last chapter of this story.